Welcome to our quiet corner. Tonight, we explore the story of a young German craftsman leaving his homeland for America. Now is the time to get comfortable. Find your favorite spot, letting your head rest gently on your pillow. Allow your shoulders to relax and release the day's worries with a slow, easy breath. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it in your little part of the world? I hope your perfectly scheduled or wonderfully chaotic day is finally winding down into peace. If you find these stories bring you comfort, a gentle follow or subscribe ensures we can meet here again. Now, let your mind drift away from your room. You are no longer there. Instead, you stand in a small village nestled along the Rhine River. The year is 1848. You are Friedrich, a young carpenter, and the weight of an immense decision rests upon you. The familiar scent of cut wood and damp earth hangs in your small workshop, but your thoughts are already an ocean away, fixed on the promise of a new life. The final shaving of oak curled away from the blade of my plane, a perfect thin ribbon of wood that smelled of the deep forest. I ran my calloused palm over the arm of the chair, feeling for any hint of roughness. There was none. It was as smooth as river stone, the grain flowing like water under my fingertips. This chair was the finest piece I had ever made, crafted from the best oak I could find, and it was for the burgomaster, our village's most important man. My work was my pride, the one thing in this world that was truly mine. The rhythmic thump scrape of my plane had been the sound of my life for as long as I could remember, a sound that brought order to the world. My father's old tools lay on the workbench beside me, their wooden handles worn dark and smooth by his hands and now by mine. I could feel the faint impressions where his fingers had gripped the saw, a connection to him that went deeper than words. He had been a fine carpenter, but a poor businessman, a trait I had unfortunately inherited. Consequently, our family was saddled with a debt that felt as heavy and immovable as the church steeple. Every finished project, every coin earned, was just a single drop of water on a very large fire. It never seemed to be enough, a fact that settled like a stone in my gut each night. A light rain had fallen that morning, and the earthy scent of damp German soil drifted in through the open door of my small workshop. It was a smell I knew better than my own name, the smell of home here in the Rhineland. For generations, my family had worked this land and this wood. Yet, while many people left for America because of grand dreams they read about in pamphlets, scholars 100 years from now might wonder if it was the promise of something new or the pain of the old that truly pushed us away. For me, it wasn't a grand dream pulling me. It was the suffocating certainty of my life here pushing me out. The church bell began to toll the midday hour, each chime marking another moment of a life I was planning to abandon. The sound echoed across the fields, a steady, reliable count of the passing time in a world that felt stuck. A deep sense of guilt twisted inside me. How could I leave my aging parents, my mother, whose dark rye bread was the taste of my childhood, and my father, whose quiet approval was the only praise I ever needed. The thought of their faces when I told them was a physical pain, a sharp ache in my chest that made it hard to draw a full breath. But staying meant a lifetime of servitude to a debt I did not create, a slow chipping away of my soul until nothing was left but sawdust. Just then, the burgomaster himself appeared at the door, blocking the light. He was a large man, whose fine wool coat seemed to take up more space than was fair. He inspected the chair not with an artist's eye, but with the calculating gaze of a man counting his coins. He rocked it back and forth, testing its balance with a grunt. He even turned it over to inspect the joints, a thing only a man who suspects he is being cheated would do. I had spent weeks on those joints, fitting them so perfectly they needed no nails, only the strength of the wood itself. He grunted again, a sound that could have meant anything, but from him I knew it was reluctant approval. He reached into his purse and pulled out a few coins, dropping them into my hand. The clink was pathetic, a sound far too small for the work I had done. "Good, sturdy work, Friedrich," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of praise that costs nothing. "It will do." He didn't understand that a chair wasn't just sturdy work. It had a spirit. Some old carpenters even said you had to be careful not to trap a bit of your own soul in the wood. Looking at the burgomaster, I thought perhaps his soul was too big to fit in a chair, or more likely, too small to notice. He and his men then lifted the chair and carried it away, leaving me with a payment that would barely cover a week's worth of flour. I stood there for a long time, the cool metal of the coins pressing into my palm. Part of me, the dutiful son, wanted to run straight to my father and hand him the money, a small offering against the great wall of our debt. It would bring a brief look of relief to his tired eyes. But another, more desperate part of me knew it was pointless. That money would disappear in an instant, and we would be in the exact same position next week and the week after that, and every week for the rest of my life. The hopeful whispers about America, once a distant fantasy, now became a firm, terrifying resolve in my mind. That afternoon, I walked to the edge of the village, away from the familiar sounds and smells of my workshop. I went not to the baker or the moneylender, but to a quiet stall where a man sold used travel goods. My heart pounded against my ribs with each step, a trader's drumbeat. With the burgomaster's coins, I purchased a sturdy leather pack, one with strong buckles and thick straps. It was not new, but it was solid, built to last. Holding it felt different than holding one of my tools. My tools were for building things up. This pack was for tearing my own life down, for leaving it all behind. The purchase felt like a profound betrayal, and, at the same time, the first true step toward my own salvation. I smuggled the pack back to my workshop, hiding it beneath a pile of wood shavings in the corner where no one ever looked. The act of hiding it made my decision real. It was no longer a dream or a desperate wish. It was a secret, a solid object with weight and form. Now, the scent of the pine forest that bordered our village no longer felt comforting. It felt like the bars of a cage I had to escape. The taste of my mother's bread would no longer be just food. It would be a memory I would have to carry with me across an ocean. That night, sleep would not come. I lay on my simple straw mattress, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling. The low murmur of my parents' voices from their room, the creak of a floorboard, the distant bark of a dog. Each sound was a thread tying me to this place. With my decision, I had taken a sharp knife and begun to saw through each and every one of those threads. I imagined myself on a great ship, the endless water stretching out in every direction. Would my skill with wood and chisel be enough to build a new life? Or would I be swallowed by a world too big and too strange for a simple village carpenter? I thought about the stories I had heard. Tales of endless forests in America, where the trees were so wide that 3 men holding hands could not circle them. Land was said to be cheap, and a man was judged not by his family's name, but by the sweat of his brow and the skill in his hands. It sounded like a paradise, but I knew the truth was likely harder and more complicated. Yet the possibility, the simple chance that it might be true, was a flicker of light in the deep darkness of my future here. The risk of the unknown suddenly seemed less frightening than the certainty of a life spent paying for the past. The choice I made with those few coins had changed everything. It was a secret I now carried, heavier than my finest tools. Every conversation with my parents was now shadowed by what I was not saying. Every familiar sight in the village was now a farewell I was silently making. The burden of this decision had settled into my bones, a deep and unfamiliar ache that spoke of the difficult road ahead. The path out of my old life had been chosen, and the cost of it was something I was only just beginning to truly understand. The travel pack, the one I had bought with the burgomaster's coins, felt heavier than any timber I had ever carried. Each strap dug into my shoulders, a constant reminder of the home I was leaving behind with every step. My father had not spoken a word, simply placed his worn hand on my arm, a pressure that said more than any speech. My mother pressed a small cloth bundle into my hand. Inside were 2 loaves of dark bread and a piece of dried sausage. Their familiar weight in my pack was a comfort and an ache all at once. I joined a small group at the edge of the village, a cooper and his family, and a weaver I knew only by sight. We did not speak of our reasons. We simply turned our faces toward the road leading north, a path that would eventually take us toward the great river and the sea. As we traveled, the world I knew dissolved behind me. The quiet paths of my forest gave way to wider, rutted roads packed with carts and strangers. The constant clatter of iron-shod wheels on stone was a sound I had never heard for more than an hour at a time. Now it was the rhythm of my days. My life had been measured by the sound of the church bell, but here time was marked by the shouts of drivers and the creaking of wagon axles. I spent most of my time walking beside a lumbering cart. We paid a few coins to carry our belongings, the motion making my stomach turn. This new reality meant that my body was always tired in a different way, not from the satisfying work of a plane on wood, but from the simple, grinding effort of moving forward into the unknown. Our first stop in a town large enough to have more than one inn was overwhelming. We found a place where the ground floor was a single vast room filled with people. A harsh mix of sounds rose from the tables, shouted conversations in dialects from regions I couldn't place, the sharp clinking of heavy stone tankards, and the scraping of benches on the wooden floor. I found a corner where I could eat my mother's sausage, its salty, smoky flavor a connection to all I had lost. To save my provisions, I bought a mug of ale. It was bitter and thin, nothing like the rich beer from our village festivals, but it washed the dust from my throat. All around me were people whose faces were etched with the same mix of hope and fear I felt stirring in my own chest. This town was also where the true test began, securing our official exit papers. The process involved visiting a series of small, dim offices, each one demanding a different document and another small fee. In one room, a clerk with ink-stained fingers looked at my village papers with disdain before stamping them with a heavy thud and pushing them back without a word. My small store of coins seemed to shrink with every stamp. The weaver from my group, a man who had traveled before, advised me to pay a little extra to one of the clerks to ensure there were no delays. I found myself torn, watching my money disappear. Part of me wanted to trust his experience, yet my own caution, born from years of dealing with the burgomaster, made me suspicious of every outstretched hand.
Because of this gnawing fear of being cheated, I chose to follow the official process exactly, refusing to pay any unofficial fees. This meant I spent 2 extra days in the town, sleeping on a straw pallet in the inn's stable because it was cheaper than a bed. During that time, my funds dwindled further on simple food. I watched other families who had paid the extra coins receive their papers and leave. Each passing hour felt like a failure, a small punishment for my own stubbornness. The feeling of being an outsider, so easily tricked, was a constant weight. I checked my remaining money a dozen times a day, counting the coins, their smooth, cool surfaces, a stark measure of how little room I had for error. Finally, with my papers in order, our small group made its way to the bustling river port of Rotterdam. It was a city built of brick and water, filled with canals and warehouses larger than any building I had ever seen. The air here was different, carrying a sharp, briny scent of the distant sea, mixed with the powerful odor of tar used to seal the hulls of countless ships. Here I met an agent in a crowded office, a fast-talking man who laid out the options for passage to America. He spoke of the ship, the Britannia, as if it were a floating palace, but his eyes never quite met mine. He offered 2 choices for the crossing. One was a space in a smaller section with fewer families, and a guarantee of being near a ventilation grate. The other, he explained, was the standard passage, considerably cheaper, but with no such promises of comfort. The agent's description of the cheaper passage was brief, almost dismissive. He called it communal and economical, words that sounded clean and simple. However, the memory of my family's debt, the reason I stood in this chaotic office in the first place, was a powerful force. The price difference between the two options was not vast, but it represented more than a month's wages for my father. That amount of money could buy a good set of American tools or feed me for weeks while I searched for work. The comfort of the voyage felt like a luxury I could not afford, a short-lived pleasure that might cost me dearly once I reached the New World.
I thought of the burgomaster's finely finished chair and the insulting pittance he paid me for it. That memory hardened my resolve. A few weeks of discomfort seemed a small price to pay for a better chance at true independence, for a life where my skill would be rewarded fairly. The seasoned traveler's advice back in the town echoed in my mind. He had laughed and said that all the ships were crowded, and a few extra feet of space made little difference once the storms began. His cynical words, which I had mistrusted before, now seemed like practical wisdom. The more expensive passage felt like a trap for the naive, a way to separate hopeful travelers from their last coins before the real journey even started. And so my decision was made. I will take the standard passage, I told the agent, pushing the smaller pile of coins across his worn desk. He scooped them up without a second glance and began writing out my ticket. My heart hammered in my chest, a mix of relief at having saved the money and a deep, unsettling worry that I had just made a terrible mistake. The agent did not seem to care one way or the other. To him, I was just another name on a long list, another body to be loaded onto the great ship. He was selling passage, but what I was buying felt much larger. It was a gamble on my own endurance. I clutched the thin piece of paper he handed me. It felt fragile, easily torn or lost, yet it held the entire weight of my future. Leaving the agent's office, the sounds of the port city seemed to fade into a dull roar. My mind was already below the decks of the Britannia, wondering about the space I had just purchased. I tried to imagine it, but my mind could only picture the dark, cramped root cellar behind my family's cottage. I hoped, with a desperate sort of prayer, that it would be better than that. That walk through the unfamiliar streets of Rotterdam, holding the document that would take me away from the old world forever, felt like the final, irreversible step. The shouts in Dutch, the cries of gulls overhead, the scent of fish and tar, it was all a blur. My focus was entirely on that small ticket in my hand and the choice it represented. The thought of that decision, made in a stuffy office hundreds of miles from anyone I knew, stayed with me as I sought out a place to wait for the ship's departure. The final leg of our journey on land ended not with a sense of accomplishment, but with a sudden, overwhelming assault on my senses. As we crested a small rise in the road, the city of Rotterdam spread before us, and beyond it, a sight that stopped my breath and rooted my feet to the ground. It was a forest, but one made not of pine or oak, but of countless wooden masts, their tops scraping against the low-hanging clouds. The scale of it was impossible to grasp. My whole village could have fit into one of the massive stone warehouses that lined the water, and the ships themselves looked larger than our church. the dull clatter of our cart on the cobblestones was lost in a new, harsh mix of sounds that rolled toward us. A constant rumble of voices, the sharp crack of whips, and the unending, lonely cries of birds that wheeled in the sky. This chaotic scene led us directly into the heart of the port, a confusing maze of people and cargo. The briny tang of salt water was sharp in my throat, a taste so different from the earthy sense of home. It mingled with the heavy, almost medicinal odor of tar, which men were painting onto the hulls of ships with wide brushes. This smell, I learned, came from the pine tar and oakum, a kind of rope fiber they used to seal the planks and keep the sea out. My eyes darted everywhere, trying to make sense of the tumult. I saw a family, much like the one I left, openly weeping as an official in a smart coat declared their travel papers invalid. Nearby, a fast-talking agent promised a man a swift journey on a fine ship, all while his other hand was deep in the man's coin purse. My own small bag of coins felt suddenly very heavy, and I clutched it tightly through the fabric of my trousers. After hours of being directed from one shouting clerk to another, I finally stood before the vessel named on my ticket, the Britannia. She was not the grandest ship in the harbor, but she was broad and sturdy, her timbers stained dark by salt and sun. A great deal of scholarly debate back home had centered on ship design, with some arguing for narrower, faster ships. Looking at the Britannia, however, I could see she was built not for speed, but for carrying as much cargo and as many people as possible. A shiver of doubt, cold and sharp, ran through me. Was my skill with a chisel and saw enough to build a life in a world this vast? Or would I simply be swallowed, a tiny speck of sawdust in this enormous, churning machine of a city? The vast gray ocean stretching out behind the ship offered no answers, only a blank and imposing silence. The task of getting my heavy tool chest aboard became my immediate focus, a welcome physical problem to distract from the anxieties swirling in my mind. The gangplank was a simple bridge of two wide, splintery planks leading from the dock to the ship's deck. It bounced slightly with every person who crossed it. As I wrestled my chest toward it, I felt the rough wood under my palms, assessing its strength with a carpenter's instinct. The joinery where it met the ship's railing looked secure enough, but the wood itself was worn. I watched a sailor, nimble as a spider, run up the plank with a coil of rope over his shoulder, and then saw an old woman hesitate at the bottom, her eyes wide with fear. The contrast between their movements showed me that this small bridge was the first true test of our new lives. Hoisting the chest onto my shoulder, I leaned into the weight and began my ascent. Each step required immense effort, the awkward load trying to pull me sideways. The cries of the gulls sounded louder now, circling directly overhead, as if mocking my slow progress. Below me, the water between the ship and the dock was a dark, churning gap. One misplaced step, one moment of lost balance, and everything I owned, the tools that were my only real wealth, my extension of my own hands, would be lost to the murky bottom. My arms burned and sweat dripped into my eyes, but I kept my gaze fixed on the deck.
It was a relief beyond words when my feet finally touched the solid, tar-scented planking of the Britannia, and I let the chest slide from my shoulder with a heavy thud. Following a sailor's curt gesture, I descended a steep ladder into the space below deck. The change was immediate and startling. The open sky vanished, replaced by a low ceiling of massive dark beams. The light from a few small grated openings did little to push back the gloom. And here, the consequence of my choice on the road became painfully clear. To save those few coins, I had condemned myself to this. It was not a berth, but a crowded shelf, a space so packed with bodies and bundles that there was hardly room to stand. The unhealthy air was stagnant and made each breath feel tight in my chest. Men, women, and children were crammed together, their faces pale in the dim light. The low murmur of conversation in our German tongue was a small comfort, but it could not mask the grim reality of our new, temporary home. Finding my designated spot was a challenge in itself, a small section of a wide shared bunk. It was barely wide enough for my shoulders. I saw the weaver and his family from my journey huddled nearby, the wife trying to comfort their small coughing child. My heart sank for them and for myself. This would be our world for weeks, perhaps months. Doubt returned, no longer a shiver, but a heavy cloak. I had left a life of debt and servitude, but what had I purchased with my freedom? A dark, cramped box on a vast, unforgiving sea. I ran my hand along the rough-hewn wood of the bunk above me, a place where another family was already settling in. My practiced fingers found a small loose board, one that rattled with the gentle rocking of the ship at the dock.
A sense of purpose, small but vital, flickered within me. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my small whittling knife. It was not the right tool for the job, not like my chisels locked away in the chest, but it would have to do. Carefully, quietly, I began to shave a thin wedge from a piece of scrap wood I found on the floor. The other passengers watched me with dull curiosity. What was this young man doing, fussing with the ship's construction? They could not understand that for me, this was a way of fighting back against the chaos. It was a tiny act of order in a world that had suddenly become disorderly. I was a carpenter. I made things fit. I made them strong. After a few minutes of careful work, I had a slender, precisely angled wedge. I slid it firmly into the gap beside the loose board, tapping it gently with the handle of my knife until it was snug. The rattling stopped. The board was now silent and secure. It was a minuscule improvement in our wretched conditions, one that almost no one else would even notice. But as I leaned back against the hard wall of the hull, I felt a sliver of my confidence return. I might be just one man in a crowd of desperate people, but I had my hands and my knowledge. I had seen the vast ocean and felt its intimidating power, but I had also found a way to impose my own small measure of order upon the chaos. That tiny act of craftsmanship, a silent correction in the belly of the great ship, would become a memory I held onto tightly in the days to come. It was a reminder that even when swallowed by overwhelming circumstances, a man's skill was still his own. The groan of the ship's timbers, the cries of the gulls, the scent of tar and salt, these were the new sounds and smells of my life. I had observed the raw, intimidating machinery of this new world, and it had nearly paralyzed me with fear. Yet in that moment, I understood that I was not entirely powerless within it. The journey had barely begun, but I had just laid my own first invisible plank on the path ahead. The last glimpse of Rotterdam was of its church spires, sharp black needles against a pale gray sky. As the ship, the Britannia, was guided from the harbor, the busy sounds of the port faded, replaced by the shouts of sailors and the slap of water against the hull. I watched until the land was just a low smudge on the horizon, a final, fading line between the life I had known and the vast, uncertain sea ahead. Then it was gone. The finality of that moment settled in my stomach, a cold, heavy weight that had nothing to do with the gentle rocking of the waves. Turning away from the rail, I descended the ladder back into the dimness below deck, where the true meaning of my choice to save a few coins was becoming clearer with every passing hour. The unhealthy air was already making my chest feel tight, a collection of too many breaths in too small a space. This feeling grew as more people came below, their shadows merging in the weak light of a single swaying lantern. The first few days blurred into a miserable rhythm of disquiet. The ship's constant movement was a torment, a ceaseless lifting and falling that turned my stomach into a knot. It was a sensation I had never known on land. The solid world I understood had been replaced by a floor that refused to stay still. Around me, in the near darkness, the sounds of others' suffering were a constant companion, a symphony of groans and quiet weeping that echoed the groaning of the ship's own timbers. My body ached from being thrown against the hard wood of my bunk. Sleep was a rare gift, often stolen by the lurch of the vessel or the sickness of a neighbor. I spent much of the time with my eyes closed, trying to imagine the stillness of my workshop, the solid feel of an oak plank under my hand. But the disorienting motion always pulled me back to the miserable present. My choice at the agent's office in Rotterdam now seemed like a profound mistake. The cheaper passage had placed me in this cramped section, a space filled with desperation. The air, never fresh to begin with, grew worse each day. It was a foul mixture of unwashed bodies, stale food, and the sharp, sour scent of bilge water seeping up from the very bottom of the ship. I learned to take shallow breaths, to turn my face to the rough wall of the hull when I slept, seeking a sliver of separation from the person sleeping inches away. We were packed so tightly that the warmth of strangers was a constant, unwelcome presence. Privacy was a forgotten luxury. Every moment was shared, every cough and sigh heard by all. It was in this suffocating closeness that I first truly noticed the family of weavers, a father, a mother, and a small, pale child, huddled together in the bunk across from mine, trying to create a small island of family in a sea of strangers. The days were marked not by the sun, which we rarely saw, but by the distribution of our food. Twice a day, a sailor would bring down a barrel of hardtack and a bucket of water.
The hardtack was a biscuit, baked so hard it felt like a piece of wood in my hand. To eat it, I had to soak it in my water ration until it softened into a tasteless, gritty paste. This was our only food, the same meal day after day. Its blandness was oppressive, a constant reminder of our lowly status on this vessel. The hunger I felt was a dull, constant ache, very different from the sharp hunger one feels after a hard day's work. This was a hunger of emptiness, of slow starvation, and it chipped away at our spirits as much as our bodies. I watched the weaver's child refuse her portion one day, her small face tight with misery, and saw the parent's quiet despair.
Amidst the filth and the endless, disorienting motion, the greatest struggle was to hold on to some piece of myself. The misery was like a thick mud, threatening to pull everyone down into a state of silent endurance, without hope or thought for the future. Some people gave into it, lying in their bunks all day with a vacant look in their eyes. Others became irritable, starting bitter arguments over a spilled water ration or an accidental shove in the darkness. I found myself torn between these two paths. Part of me wanted to retreat completely, to build a wall around myself and simply wait for the journey to end, one way or another. Yet something inside me resisted. I would run my thumb over the handle of the small carving knife in my pocket, the smooth wood a connection to my trade, to the man I was before I stepped onto this ship. One evening, as the ship creaked its weary song, the weaver's little girl began to cough, a dry, weak sound that carried through the gloom. She had been listless for days, barely moving, and now this new affliction seemed to drain the last of her strength. Her mother held her, murmuring soft words in our German dialect that I could not quite hear. I watched them for a long time, their small drama illuminated by the faint, swinging light of the lantern. In my pack, wrapped carefully in a linen cloth, was my last piece of home, a small, dried apple from my mother's garden, saved for a moment of true need. My own throat was parched and my stomach rumbled, but the sound of that child's struggle was something I could not ignore. The thought wrestled inside me, to keep this last comfort for myself, or to give it away. Making my decision, I reached into my pack and unwrapped the fruit. Its faint, sweet scent was a ghost of my family's orchard, a painful and beautiful memory. I shuffled over to the weaver's bunk, moving carefully on the swaying floor. The father looked up, his eyes wary in the dim light. I did not say much, for words felt useless. I simply held out a small piece of the dried apple. "For the child," I whispered. "It might help her throat." The mother looked from the apple to my face, her expression a mix of surprise and exhaustion. She took the piece with a trembling hand and, after a moment's hesitation, gently coaxed her daughter to take a small bite. It was a tiny act in this great, dark space, but it felt important. A silent understanding passed between us, a bond forged not with words, but with a shared piece of fruit in the belly of a ship. That small gesture changed something in our little corner of the vessel. The weaver and I began to speak occasionally, sharing stories of our villages, of the work we did with our hands. He spoke of the loom, of the feel of the shuttle passing back and forth, and I spoke of the grain of wood, of the satisfaction of a perfect joint. We were two craftsmen adrift, finding common ground in our shared respect for skilled work. It made me wonder about all the others packed in around us. How many farmers, bakers, and blacksmiths were in this darkness, their skills useless at sea? How does a person hold on to who they are when everything that defines them, their home, their tools, their community, has been stripped away? Perhaps, I thought, we are defined not just by what we do, but by the small kindnesses we can still offer when we have almost nothing left. The endless groaning of the ship's timbers became a language I started to understand. In my old life, I could listen to a roof beam and know if the wood was sound or stressed. Here, the entire world was made of wood under immense strain, and its constant complaints spoke of a terrifying power held barely in check. Every creak was a question, every shudder an answer from the deep. Some nights the sounds were so loud, a chorus of shrieks and moans from the very bones of the ship, that I was certain it would break apart and send us all to the bottom of the black ocean. Yet it held, and we continued on, carried forward by a strength I could not see, only hear. The journey stretched on, far longer than the agent had promised. Weeks bled into one another, marked only by the slow emptying of the water barrels and the growing weariness in everyone's faces. The initial sickness passed for most, replaced by a deep, bone-weary fatigue. I often thought of my parents and my village, but the memories were beginning to feel like scenes from someone else's life. My world had shrunk to the space of this bunk, to the taste of hardtack, to the constant motion of the waves. My life as a carpenter had taught me about patience and endurance, about working with a difficult piece of wood until it yielded. My craft had led me to this strange floating world, where the challenge was not to shape wood, but to prevent my own spirit from being warped by the immense grinding pressure of the sea. The small repair to the bunk above my head offered little comfort once the land disappeared. For the first day or two, there had been a kind of nervous excitement among us, a sense that we were part of some grand adventure. That feeling, however, was short-lived, washed away by the relentless rhythm of the ocean. The ship was a living thing, and its voice was a constant groan. Timbers and beams, great ribs of oak that I would have once admired for their strength, now protested every wave with a deep, weary sound that worked its way into my bones. Lying in the near darkness, I could feel the entire vessel rise, hang for a moment in space, and then fall with a sickening lurch that sent my stomach climbing into my throat. The world was no longer solid. It was a cradle rocked by a careless giant. This constant, disorienting motion brought on a misery that spread through our cramped quarters like a fever. I spent the first week fighting a constant battle with my own body, my hands gripping the edge of my bunk as another wave of nausea rolled through me. Around me, the sounds were of human suffering, retching, moaning, and the quiet weeping of those who had never imagined such a state of being. The small space I had paid for, the one I chose to save a few precious coins, now felt like a trap.
There was no escape from the sounds or the smells that came with this widespread sickness, and each breath I took felt heavy and used, as if it had been passed through a dozen other lungs before reaching mine. Because of this, the air itself became an opponent. It carried the sharp odor of bilge water, the foul liquid that collected in the very bottom of the ship, mixed with the powerful scent of unwashed bodies and the sourness of spoiled food. At first, I tried to breathe through my mouth, but that only made the taste of our shared confinement more real. I would pull the thin, rough blanket over my head, but the smell was woven into its very fibers. This was the consequence of my choice at the port, a decision made with an eye toward a future that now seemed impossibly distant. Saving that money had bought me a place in this suffocating darkness, and I could do nothing but endure it. Our days soon fell into a grim routine, measured not by the sun, which we could not see, but by the distribution of our food. Twice a day, a sailor would bring down a sack of hardtack and a barrel of water. Hardtack was a simple, rock-hard biscuit made of flour, water, and salt, then baked until it was nearly indestructible. It was food meant to last, not to be enjoyed. I would gnaw on a piece for an hour, my teeth aching, the taste bland and dusty in my mouth. Sometimes it was crawling with weevils, small black insects, and the older travelers told us to just eat them in the dark. A bit of extra meat, one old farmer joked without a hint of a smile, and no one laughed. Time itself seemed to stretch and warp in the gloom below deck. With no windows, the only hint of the world outside came from the small amount of light that filtered down when the hatch to the deck was opened. The long, gray hours blurred together, and I started marking the days by scratching a line on the wooden wall next to my bunk with a small nail. 1 line, 2, then 7. A week had passed. The passage was meant to take 6 weeks, perhaps 8. The thought of enduring this for another month or even longer was a weight almost too heavy to bear. The physical misery was one thing, but the slow erosion of hope was another, more dangerous enemy. This crushing sameness began to wear on everyone's nerves. Arguments would flare up over nothing, a stray foot taking up too much room, a louder than usual cough, a perceived unfairness in the water ration. The harsh mix of sounds was no longer just groaning wood and seasickness, but the bitter, sharp tones of desperation. A part of me wanted to retreat completely, to build a wall around myself and speak to no one until we reached Philadelphia. It seemed the safest path, to simply become another shadow in the dark, preserving what little energy and spirit I had left for the life that was supposed to come after this ordeal. It was a tempting silence. However, across the narrow passageway from my bunk was a family of weavers from a village not far from my own. There was a father, a mother, and a small daughter of perhaps 5 or 6 years. While others argued, they remained quiet, their movements economical and deliberate in the tiny space they shared. The mother would hum old folk songs to the little girl, her voice a thin thread of comfort in the oppressive gloom. The father, a man with calloused hands like my own, would simply nod at me in the dim light of the swaying lanterns. They did not complain, they simply endured, and their quiet dignity was a small point of light in the overwhelming darkness.
After the second week, the little girl grew ill. Her mother's soft humming was replaced by the child's weak, whimpering cries. Her feverish restlessness was clear even in the poor light. The ship's water, drawn from barrels that had been sealed for weeks, was often brackish and unpleasant, and it did her no good. I watched the mother try to soothe her, dipping a corner of a cloth into their water ration to wet the girl's lips. The father's face, usually so calm, was a mask of helpless worry. His silence was now heavier, filled with a fear that I understood completely. To be so powerless, trapped in a wooden box on an endless sea while your child suffers, felt like the cruelest fate of all. That sight broke through the wall I had been trying to build around myself. I remembered a small cloth-wrapped bundle my mother had pressed into my hand just before I left. It was the last thing she had given me, her hands trembling as she did so. "For when your spirit is low," she had whispered. Inside were a dozen slices of dried apple from our own trees, carefully prepared to last the journey. They were a treasure, a tangible piece of home that I had been saving for my own weakest moment. I found myself torn, my own hunger and desire for a taste of home warring with the image of that sick child. But what good was a memory of home if I lost my own humanity on the way to building a new one? With my mind made up, I carefully unwrapped the bundle. The faint, sweet scent of the apples was a shocking contrast to the foulness surrounding me. I took out a single, perfect slice and made my way across the shifting floor. I knelt by their bunk, holding it out to the mother. She stared at me first with suspicion, her eyes narrowed in the lantern light. In this place, kindness was so rare it was often mistaken for a trick. I said nothing, simply keeping my hand outstretched. Her expression softened, and she took the slice with a hand that trembled slightly. She broke off a tiny piece and gave it to her daughter. The child, who had refused the hard biscuit, slowly chewed the soft, sweet fruit. The mother looked at me, and her eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it needed no words. The father placed a hand on my shoulder and squeezed, a silent acknowledgement that passed between us. I returned to my bunk, leaving them to their private moment. I had one less slice of apple, one less taste of home for myself, but my own spirits felt lighter than they had in weeks. The ship still groaned, the air was still foul, and the journey ahead remained long and uncertain. But for the first time since we had lost sight of land, I felt like more than just a piece of cargo being transported from one continent to another. Back in my own cramped space, I lay listening to the familiar sounds of the ship. The child's whimpering had quieted, replaced by the soft sounds of her sleeping. The small human connection I had made, a silent alliance forged over a single piece of dried fruit, felt both fragile and weighty in the darkness. It was a reminder that even in the most desperate of circumstances, we could choose to be more than just strangers suffering in close quarters. We could be neighbors. The knowledge of that simple choice and its quiet power felt both precious and essential to my survival. The uneasy alliance I had formed with the Weaver's family was a small point of light in the endless gray. We shared our meager rations and, more importantly, a silent understanding.
But even this small comfort was fragile, built upon the groaning timbers of a ship that felt less like a vessel and more like our shared prison. The gentle, rhythmic roll that had lulled us into a state of weary acceptance began to change one afternoon. It became a violent, unpredictable lurch, a motion that tossed us against the rough-hewn walls of our confinement. My stomach, long since emptied of anything substantial, clenched with each sickening drop. Above, the sound of sailors shouting and ropes straining against the wind signaled that this was no ordinary squall.
This new motion was different. It felt angry. The ship was no longer cutting through the waves, but was instead being lifted and slammed down by them, as if by a giant, furious hand. Water, cold and tasting sharply of salt, began to seep through the deck boards above, dripping onto our faces and bedding. The weaver's wife pulled her children close, her knuckles white as she gripped them. Each time the ship shuddered, a collective gasp went through the dark space below deck. The constant groaning of the wood I had grown used to rose in pitch to a desperate shriek, the sound of a living thing in agony. I braced myself with my hands and feet, my carpenter's mind instinctively tracing the lines of stress, feeling the immense forces trying to tear our world apart. Then came the sound that cut through the roar of the wind and water. It was not the howl of the storm, but a sharp, internal crack, loud as a gunshot in the confined space. It felt as if a bone had snapped deep within the ship's skeleton. A wave of panic, more chilling than the icy water, washed over the passengers. Screams erupted near me as a main support beam, thick as my thigh, showed a splintered, jagged fracture near its center. The wood fibers were torn and pale against the dark, tarred surface. Everyone stared at it, frozen, watching the crack widen slightly with each violent lurch of the vessel. In that moment, I understood that our fate was tied not just to the captain's skill, but to the simple integrity of wood and iron. While others were paralyzed by the sight, a different feeling took hold of me. It was a cold, clear focus that pushed the fear aside. My entire life had been spent with wood, learning its language of grain and tension. I knew its strengths, but more importantly, I knew how it failed. My eyes darted around the cargo hold, past the terrified faces, searching for anything I could use. My gaze landed on a pile of dunnage, rough, unsecured planks of oak used to separate cargo. It was not ideal, but it was strong. An idea, born from years of wrestling with timber in my quiet workshop, took shape in my mind. It was a desperate, crude solution, but it was better than waiting for the sea to claim us. I scrambled over a pile of crates, my movements clumsy in the pitching darkness, and pulled a thick plank free. It was heavy, and the rough surface tore at my hands. A sailor with a grim face and a lantern swinging wildly from his fist stumbled past. I grabbed his arm, my grip surprisingly strong. "Help me!" I shouted over the noise, pointing with the plank toward the fractured beam. "A brace! We need to brace it!" He looked from me to the crack, his eyes wide with fear, but he saw the purpose in my expression. He gave a sharp nod, understanding dawning on his face. He held the lantern high, its unsteady light casting long, dancing shadows that made our task even harder. Together, we wrestled the heavy plank into position. The space was cramped, and the ship's violent motion fought us at every turn, throwing us off balance. The sailor steadied the base of the plank while I guided the top. I had to use my knowledge of leverage, of finding the strongest point to transfer the immense pressure. I shouted instructions at him, words I would use in a workshop, now being used to fight the Atlantic Ocean. I needed to wedge it tight against the deckhead, turning the plank into a new support, a crude but strong sister to the failing beam. My fear was gone, replaced entirely by the familiar calculations of angles and forces. My entire world had shrunk to this single point of failure and the piece of wood in my hands. With a final desperate shove, we jammed the plank into place. There was a great groaning sound as the load shifted, the new brace taking some of the strain. It was not a perfect fit, not the kind of precise joinery I took pride in, but it was solid. The terrifying widening of the crack stopped. The high-pitched shriek of the failing beam lessened to a low grumble. I leaned against the wall, my chest heaving, the effort leaving my muscles trembling. The taste of salt and fear was still in my mouth, but it was mixed with the coppery tang of my own effort. My clothes were soaked with the cold seawater that dripped from above, and my hands were raw and bleeding from the splintered done-on wood.
The sailor clapped me hard on the shoulder, a gesture of rough thanks that needed no words. He scrambled away, likely to report what had happened. A short time later, the ship's carpenter, a man whose face was a map of old storms, came to inspect our work. He ran a calloused hand over the brace, his expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. He looked at the cracked beam, then back at my crude fix. After a long moment that felt like an hour, he gave me a slow, grudging nod. It was a small gesture, but in that dark, terrifying place, it felt like a medal. He saw me not just as another piece of human cargo, but as a craftsman. He and a few other sailors soon arrived with more wood and tools, working to secure the beam properly. They built upon my initial brace, making it stronger and more permanent. I stepped back, my work done, and returned to my small space near the weaver's family. The wife looked at me, her eyes filled with a new kind of respect. Her small child, who had been whimpering throughout the ordeal, was quiet now, asleep in her arms. The storm still raged outside, and the ship still pitched violently, but the immediate sense of doom had passed. The panic had been replaced by a fragile, exhausted hope. I sat in the darkness, feeling the ship move beneath me. My mind went back to my father's workshop, to the countless hours I had spent learning the nature of wood. I had always thought of my skill as a way to build things of beauty and use on solid ground. A chair, a cabinet, a roof to keep out the rain. I never imagined it would be used to hold a ship together in the middle of a vast, angry sea. It made me wonder, how many of our quiet, everyday skills are secretly weapons against chaos, just waiting for the right moment to be used? We think we are farmers or bakers or carpenters, but maybe we are all just survivors, carrying the tools of our trade into the unknown. The storm did not break for another day, but the ship held. The brace, my crude piece of woodworking,
did its job. When the violent lurching finally softened back into a weary roll, a profound quiet fell over the passengers below deck. It was not the quiet of despair, but of shared survival. I felt a change within myself, a hardening of my resolve. The doubts that had gnawed at me since leaving my village seemed smaller now, less powerful. I had faced a real and immediate threat, not with prayer or luck, but with my own two hands and the knowledge stored within them. My tool chest, lashed securely in the hold, had felt like a burden, a heavy reminder of a life I had left behind. Now, it felt different. It was a chest of possibilities, a promise that my skills had value beyond a small German village. They were not tied to one place or one kind of wood. They were a part of me, as real and as strong as bone. I had left home to escape a future of powerlessness, of being at the mercy of others. In the heart of that storm, by applying my trade, I had found a small piece of power that was entirely my own. The icy salt water had stung my eyes, and the raw wood had torn my skin, but the experience had given me something precious. It was a new kind of confidence, born not of youthful hope, but of proven ability. I had been tested against the immense, impersonal force of the ocean, and had not been broken. This terrifying passage had changed how I saw the tools I carried and the hands that wielded them. They were not just for shaping wood, they were for shaping a life. The summary: during a violent storm that cracks a support beam below deck, Friedrich uses his carpentry skills and a spare plank to fashion a crude but effective brace, preventing a potential disaster and earning the respect of the crew. End state: the ship has survived the worst of the storm. The immediate danger has been averted by Friedrich's quick thinking, and he has gained a newfound confidence in the value and applicability of his craft. The violence of the storm had passed, but it left behind a profound and unsettling stillness. The constant, thunderous roar of wind and water was replaced by a maddening quiet, broken only by the gentle sloshing of the sea against the hull. For days, the sails hung limp and useless, and our ship, the Britannia, simply drifted on an endless, gray plain of water. The ceaseless groaning of the ship's timbers, a sound that had become part of my bones during the storm, now seemed louder in the silence. It was the sound of a wounded animal, tired and lost. My own body, braced for so long against the violent lurching, felt strange on the gently rocking floor. My muscles ached with the memory of the struggle, and the brief pride I felt in securing the cracked beam below deck faded with each passing, windless hour. This unnerving calm led to a grim gathering on the main deck for those of us well enough to stand. The first mate, a man whose face was a map of past gales and frustrations, stood on a crate and delivered the news without ceremony. The storm had blown us far south of our intended course. Our journey to Philadelphia would be weeks longer than planned. As a result, he announced, all rations would be cut, most importantly, the fresh water. A low murmur of despair rippled through the assembled passengers. We had survived the sea's fury, only to be faced with a slower, quieter, and perhaps more certain danger. The mate's words hung in the still air, and I watched as hope drained from the faces around me, replaced by a hard, calculating look of survival. Because of this new reality, the daily distribution of water became a tense ritual. We would line up, each holding our small tin cup, and a sailor would ladle out a meager portion from the cask. The water itself tasted unpleasant, with a metallic flavor from the barrel and a faint hint of salt that did nothing to quench our thirst. I would let the small amount of liquid sit in my mouth for a moment before swallowing, trying to make it last longer. It was never enough. A constant, dry rasp settled deep in my throat, and a dull ache began to form behind my eyes. My movements became more deliberate, more sluggish, as my body tried to conserve what little moisture it had. The simple act of climbing the ladder from our quarters to the deck required a noticeable effort. This new quiet did little to bring peace. Instead, the close quarters below deck became a breeding ground for bitter arguments. A family from Bavaria accused another of stealing a crust of bread. Two men who had been friendly before came to blows over a blanket that one had supposedly shifted in the night. The unhealthy air in our cramped section seemed to amplify every whisper and grievance. Among the passengers was a former schoolmaster, a thin man with spectacles who, despite our situation, enjoyed explaining things. He would lecture anyone who would listen about the dangers of miasma, the unhealthy air he claimed was rising from the bilge and causing sickness. It's a scholarly debate I found particularly useless as I watched people grow weaker, not from the air, but from the clear lack of clean water. My own discomfort was mirrored and magnified in the small form of the weaver's daughter. The little girl with whom I had shared my dried apple weeks ago had become terrifyingly frail. Her fever, which had begun during the storm, now refused to break. Her weak, whimpering cries were a constant, heartbreaking sound in our corner of the ship, a sound that cut through the arguments and the groaning of the wood. Her mother sat by her side day and night, trying to coax her to drink the brackish water ration, but the child would only turn her head away or spit the little she swallowed back up. I watched the parent's hope turn to a raw, hollow-eyed fear, and a profound sense of helplessness washed over me. That feeling of uselessness was a heavy weight. My hands, calloused and strong from a lifetime of shaping wood, felt clumsy and foolish. I could brace a beam against the power of the ocean. I could carve a perfect dovetail joint blindfolded, but I could not make a fever go down. I could not create a single drop of clean water. My tool chest, my most prized possession, and the key to my future, sat under my bunk like a coffin full of pointless instruments. What good was a chisel or a plane against thirst and sickness? The confidence I had gained during the storm felt like a distant memory, a brief moment of purpose in an overwhelming sea of powerlessness. As I sat there, lost in these grim thoughts, a memory surfaced, as clear as if it were yesterday. I saw my grandfather, his face weathered like old oak, standing by the creek behind our village. He was showing me how to draw water for the livestock when the creek was muddy after a heavy rain. He took a long strip of clean linen, dipped one end in a bucket of cloudy water, and dangled the other end into an empty pail set lower down. "Patience, Friedrich," he had said, his voice a low rumble. "Let the cloth do the work. It drinks the water, but it leaves the dirt behind." It was such a simple trick, a piece of old-world knowledge I hadn't thought of in years. A flicker of purpose returned, a spark in the darkness of the hold. I rummaged through my travel pack and found my spare shirt, the one my mother had mended for me, the clean linen carefully folded at the bottom. Tearing a long, clean strip from the bottom felt like a sacrifice, but a necessary one. I approached the weaver, who looked at me with suspicion. I tried to explain with my limited words and many hand gestures. He looked from me to his wife, and then to their suffering child. He gave a short, sharp nod. He held their daily water ration in a small clay pot, the water looking cloudy and unappealing. This small amount was everything to them. Using my tin cup and theirs, I carefully set up my grandfather's simple system. I placed their pot on my bunk and set my empty cup on the floor below it. I soaked the strip of linen in their water and then arranged it just as I had been shown, with one end in the pot and the other hanging down into my cup. Then we waited. The only sound was the weak cry from the child and the rhythmic creak of the ship. Down the hall, I could hear the faint, steady ticking of another passenger's prized cuckoo clock, a strangely domestic sound in this place of misery. It seemed a foolish thing to bring across an ocean, but now its gentle rhythm marked the slow, agonizing passage of time as we waited for the first drop. Slowly, miraculously, a single drop of water formed at the end of the cloth strip. It swelled, glistened in the dim lantern light, and fell with a tiny plink into the cup below. Then another and another. It was a painstaking process, but after nearly an hour, a small amount of clearer water had collected in the bottom of my cup. It wasn't perfect, but the visible sediment and metallic sheen were gone. The schoolmaster shuffled by, muttering about the importance of ventilation, but I ignored him. We were not fighting bad air. We were fighting bad water, and this was our only weapon. The weaver's wife dipped her finger in the filtered water and touched it to her daughter's lips. The child, who had refused everything else, licked the moisture from her mother's finger. Encouraged, the mother used the corner of a rag to gently give the girl a few more drops. She swallowed them. It was not a cure, not a miracle, but it was something. It was hope. We all knew how many children were lost on these long voyages. Their small bodies were often the first to fail. Seeing that little girl accept even a drop of cleaner water felt like a victory against the entire indifferent ocean. As I lay in my bunk that night, listening to the quiet, more peaceful breaths from the weaver's daughter, I understood something new. My skills as a carpenter were not just for building houses or furniture. The true skill was in seeing a problem and finding a solution with the tools and knowledge at hand, whether that tool was a saw or a simple strip of cloth. The storm had taught me my craft had value in a crisis. The quiet desperation that followed taught me that knowledge, even the simplest memory of a grandfather by a creek, could be just as strong as any wooden brace. I held on to this simple truth, knowing that the ability to solve a problem was more valuable than any tool in my chest. A profound stillness woke me. For weeks, the world had been a constant symphony of groaning wood and sloshing water, a rhythm that had worked its way into my very bones. But now there was only silence, broken by the distant cry of a bird I did not recognize. The ship was no longer moving. We had arrived. A nervous energy moved through the darkness below deck, a mix of hope and fear whispered in German from bunk to bunk. The weaver and his family, my quiet companions in misery, gathered their small bundles with trembling hands. We had survived the ocean, but a new, unknown challenge lay just beyond the ship's hull. That first breath of American air was a shock to my system. After so long breathing the stale, recycled air of the hold, this new air was so full of life, it almost made me dizzy. It was a dense, unfamiliar mix of scents: the sharp perfume of pine trees, the rich smell of damp earth after a rain, and the unfamiliar tang of wood smoke from the city's countless chimneys. It was the smell of a vast and unknown forest, even here in this bustling port. As we were herded toward the gangplank, a wooden ramp leading down to the dock, I felt the sun on my face for the first time in what felt like an eternity. I had to shield my eyes, which had grown accustomed to the perpetual twilight below deck. The moment my boot touched the solid wood of the wharf, my knees nearly buckled. It was such a strange and wonderful feeling, the ground staying perfectly still beneath my feet. There was no sway, no lurch, just the unyielding certainty of land. For a long moment, I simply stood there, gripping the rope railing and letting the profound relief wash over me. All around, others were doing the same, some falling to their knees to kiss the planks, others weeping openly with joy. We had made it. This simple fact was so overwhelming, it temporarily erased all the hardship of the voyage. The solid ground was a promise, a confirmation that we had not been swallowed by the endless sea.
This feeling of peace, however, was short-lived. The dock was a whirlwind of frantic activity and harsh sounds. Men shouted in English, a language that struck my ears as a confusing torrent of sharp, clipped noises. Carts rumbled over the cobblestones, their iron-rimmed wheels making a terrible racket. Officials in stern-looking uniforms herded us into lines, their gestures impatient, their voices loud. In the confusion, I lost sight of the weaver's family, swallowed by the press of bodies. Suddenly, I felt a deep and profound loneliness. The silent bond we had formed in the darkness of the ship was broken, and I was utterly on my own. It is a difficult thing to stand in a crowd of people and feel completely isolated. You might wonder how a person finds their way when they cannot understand a single word being spoken around them. Every sign was a puzzle. Every shouted direction was just noise. My only anchor was the heavy tool chest I clutched in my hand, the familiar weight, a small comfort in this bewildering new world. I watched as some families were greeted by relatives, their tearful reunions a sharp contrast to my own solitude. Others were approached by well-dressed men who spoke German, their smiles wide and their promises grand. One of these men approached me, his German smooth and reassuring. He pointed to my calloused hands and my tool chest. "A carpenter," he said, his voice friendly. "There is much work for a man of skill. I can arrange everything for you. A good master, a warm bed, 3 meals a day. All you need to do is sign a paper." He spoke of an indenture, a contract where I would work for a number of years to pay for my passage and my keep.
It was a tempting offer. I was exhausted, hungry, and my purse was nearly empty. The thought of a guaranteed meal and a roof over my head was almost enough to make me agree.
But as he spoke, I saw not a kind helper, but the face of the burgomaster from my village. I remembered the feeling of being trapped by debt, of working hard only to see my earnings disappear into another man's pocket. This indenture, this contract, felt like a different kind of cage, one I had just crossed an ocean to escape. A part of me screamed to accept his offer, to choose the easy path of security. Yet the memory of my father's tired face, worn down by a lifetime of service to others, compelled me to resist. I had not come this far to trade one master for another. "No," I said, my voice hoarse but firm. "I will find my own way." The man's friendly smile vanished instantly. He gave a short, dismissive laugh, muttered something in English to a colleague nearby, and turned his attention to a more desperate-looking family. The brief exchange left me shaken, but also strangely empowered. I had faced my first test in this new land and had not failed. Holding on to my freedom was more important than a full stomach, at least for now. This decision meant I was truly alone, with no safety net and no guide to help me. Clutching my chest of tools, I made my way through the inspection line. An official with a tired face looked at my papers, grunted, and stamped them with a heavy thud. He pointed me away from the docks toward the city that rose up beyond the forest of masts. The sounds of the port were a chaotic mix of industry and humanity. Hammers striking iron in a blacksmith's shop, the rhythmic sawing of wood, and the endless chatter of a language I did not know. Each step required effort, the weight of my tools pressing down on my shoulders, a constant reminder of the trade that was my only hope. I paused to buy a piece of bread from a street vendor. The transaction a clumsy affair of pointing and holding out a few precious coins. The bread was different from my mother's dark, dense loaves. It was lighter, with a slightly sweet taste. As I ate, I watched the people around me. They moved with a purpose and confidence I could not imagine feeling. Everyone seemed to know where they were going, what they were doing. I was an outsider, a ghost from another world, adrift in their reality. This feeling was more intimidating than any storm at sea. Following the flow of the crowd, I walked away from the water. The sharp, briny smell of the harbor gradually gave way to the smells of the city proper. Baking bread from a bakery, the scent of horses from the street, and the faint, sweet smell of blooming flowers from a hidden garden. There were buildings made of a brilliant red brick I had never seen before, taller than any I knew back home. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming, a testament to the energy and ambition of this new world. I knew there were other Germans here, in a place they called Germantown, but I had no map, no guide,
only a vague direction given by a kind-faced woman who understood my fumbling attempts to ask for help. With the heavy tool chest digging into my shoulder, I walked on. Each step was an act of faith. I had refused the easy path of servitude, choosing instead the hard, uncertain road of independence. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach, but beneath it a tiny flame of determination burned. I had my health, my skills, and my freedom. In this new world, I hoped that would be enough. My entire life was contained in the wooden box I carried, its familiar weight both a burden and a promise of what I might build. My journey to find a place for myself had just begun, and this bustling, noisy city was a wilderness of its own kind. The forest of trees I expected to face was instead a forest of people, and navigating it would require a different set of skills entirely. My long voyage to escape the debts of the old world had delivered me to the doorstep of 1,000 new challenges, each one hidden behind a face I could not read and a language I could not speak. Walking away from the docks, my tool chest, a familiar, solid weight on my shoulder, felt like the first true decision I had made for myself. The cacophony of English faded behind me, replaced by the rumble of wagons on stone streets. My goal was simple: to find the sound of my own language. I had been told that other Germans had settled on the edges of the great city of Philadelphia, creating a community of their own. For hours I walked, following whispered directions from a kind baker who saw the hopeful exhaustion on my face, until the city's tight-packed buildings gave way to wider plots of land with sturdy, simple houses. It was then that I heard it, the familiar cadence of a Rhineland dialect, and a wave of relief so powerful washed over me that my knees nearly buckled. This area, which they called Germantown, was a haven of familiar sounds in a strange land. Here, women called to their children in my mother tongue, and the sharp, clean scent of freshly sawn pine lumber hung in the afternoon. It was the smell of my trade, the perfume of my past life, and it gave me the courage to approach a construction site where several men were raising the frame of a new barn. I watched them for a time, observing their methods. They worked with a speed that was almost brutal, their movements broad and powerful. Their tools seemed to reflect this. The axes they used were heavier in the head than the ones I knew, designed for felling trees with sheer force, rather than shaping wood with precision. Believing my skills would be a welcome addition, I approached the foreman, a broad-shouldered man with sawdust in his beard. I explained, in careful German, that I was a master carpenter, trained in the old country, skilled in joinery and finishing. To prove my point, I took 2 small scraps of wood from a pile and, with my sharpest chisel, quickly cut the interlocking pieces of a dovetail joint, a connection both strong and beautiful, without need for a single nail. The foreman watched, nodding, but when I fitted the 2 pieces together perfectly, he simply grunted. He then picked up a rough-hewn beam and a thick wooden peg, drove the peg through a crude hole with 3 mighty blows of a mallet, and said, "That takes 10 seconds. Yours takes 10 minutes. The trees here are endless, and winter is short. We build for warmth, not for kings." His words struck me harder than any physical blow. Everything I had dedicated my life to learning, the patient craft, the pursuit of perfection, the elegance of a well-made joint, was considered a waste of time here. Speed was the master, and utility was its only law. I felt a hot flush of shame, the pride of my craft turning to ash in my mouth. My hands, which knew the fine art of carving and inlay, were useless in a world that only wanted walls raised against the wind as quickly as possible. This new world demanded a different kind of craftsman, and I was not yet him. The realization left me feeling more lost than I had been in the middle of the vast, empty ocean. Yet, survival is a stern teacher, and my pockets were nearly empty. The foreman must have seen the desperation warring with pride on my face. He gestured to a pile of felled trees at the edge of the clearing. "I need laborers," he said, his tone not unkind. "The work is clearing these logs, stripping the branches, and dragging them to the sawyers. It is not carpenter's work, but it is pay." My whole being recoiled from the offer. It felt like a deep insult to accept such a task. But then I thought of the debt back home, the reason I had crossed an ocean, and the cold reality of an empty stomach. I found myself torn between the craftsman I was and the survivor I had to become. After a long moment, I swallowed hard and chose to accept. The first days were humbling. My work consisted of humbling. My work consisted of brute force. My companions, the biting swarm of black flies, and the constant ache in my back. The American axe felt clumsy in my grip, its balance all wrong for the delicate wrist movements I was used to. It was a tool for destruction, not creation. At midday, we would stop, and the men would share their meal of coarse, gritty bread made from ground corn. The taste was foreign to me, nothing like the dense, dark rye of home, but it was filling, and it quieted the rumbling in my belly. I ate it without complaint, watching the other men, studying the rhythm of their work, the way they used leverage to move massive logs, the quick, efficient method they used for stripping bark. This observation became my new apprenticeship. While my body was engaged in the mind-numbing labor of a woodsman, my mind was furiously taking notes. I paid close attention to the carpenters, especially how they notched the logs for the corners of a cabin. It was a technique called saddle notching, where a semicircular cut in one log allows it to rest securely on the log below. It was fast, effective, and required a completely different skill set from the precise geometric joinery I knew. They were not building furniture. They were building a fortress against the wilderness, and every action was shaped by that urgent need. My pride demanded I learn this new language of wood. Each evening, after a day of labor that left my muscles screaming and my hands raw, I would not rest. I would take scraps of wood, cast aside by the carpenters, and sit by the light of a small fire. Using a borrowed hatchet, I practiced. My first attempts were clumsy, the curves uneven, the fit sloppy. My hands, accustomed to the delicate dance of the chisel and plane, struggled with the brute force of the hatchet. Splinters bit into my fingers, and blisters rose on my palms, but I did not stop. The other laborers looked at me with a mix of pity and amusement, this strange German who worked even after the work was done. Slowly, painstakingly, my hands began to understand. I learned to feel the grain of this new wood, the straight, easy split of the poplar, the stubborn toughness of the oak. I began to see the logic in the new methods, the simple genius born of necessity. The foreman noticed my evening studies. One night he walked over, watched me fit 2 small notched logs together, and gave the same non-committal grunt he had on the first day. But this time he tossed a small curved blade at my feet. An adze, he said, referring to the special shaping tool. For scooping the notch clean. Use it. You learn fast. It was not praise, but it was an acknowledgement, and it felt like a greater victory than any coin he could have paid me. During this time, I also learned something about the land itself. Historical accounts from the period often speak of the vast, untouched forests, but living in it was another matter entirely. It wasn't just wood, it was a living system. A quirky detail I discovered was that the local Lenape people, the original inhabitants, had managed these forests for centuries with controlled burns, which cleared underbrush and promoted the growth of the tall, straight trees the settlers now valued. So, the wilderness we were taming had, in fact, been gardened for generations. This fact, learned from an older German settler who had traded with the Lenape, changed how I saw the trees I was clearing. They were not just obstacles, but part of a much older story. This re-education was the most challenging work I had ever done. It forced me to question the very foundation of my identity as a craftsman. Scholars still debate whether the rapid, practical building style of the American frontier was a true innovation or simply a temporary loss of sophisticated European skills due to harsh conditions. For me, it was not a debate. It was my daily reality. I was shedding old certainties like a snake sheds its skin, and the process was painful. I had to accept that the beautiful, intricate work that had defined me in Germany was for now a luxury this new world could not afford. Yet, with each log I notched correctly in the firelight, a different kind of pride began to grow. It was not the pride of the artist, but the pride of the survivor, the adapter. I was learning to read a new land, a new kind of tree, a new way of building. My hands were becoming calloused and strong in ways they had never been before, shaped by the handle of the axe as much as the chisel. The skills I had brought with me were not gone, merely dormant, waiting for a time when a floor needed to be level, a door needed to hang true, or a roof needed to be sound. One evening, I finally crafted a perfect saddle notch on a piece of scrap oak. The curve was clean, the fit was tight, and I knew I could replicate it quickly on a full-sized log. I held it in my hands, the wood still warm from my work. It was not as elegant as a dovetail, but it was strong, practical, and it was the key to building a life here. The future was still an unknown country, but the consequences of mastering this simple piece of wood would surely shape the foundations of whatever home I was destined to build. The weeks I spent on the edge of Philadelphia taught me a new language, one spoken not with the tongue, but with the hands. My German tools, so perfect for fine joints and smooth surfaces, remained mostly in their chest. Instead, my palms grew calloused around the thick, heavy handle of an American felling axe. I learned the satisfying thud of splitting logs for firewood and the rough skill of hewing beams, where speed was more important than grace. This work earned me enough to eat and a place to sleep in a crowded boarding house filled with the sounds and smells of my homeland. In the evenings, listening to the men talk, a new idea began to form. It was a shared whisper at first, a plan spoken of by a handful of families who, like me, had resisted the trap of indenture but found city life just another kind of cage. This growing idea soon became a solid plan. 4 other families, a blacksmith, a weaver, a farmer, and a baker, had pooled their meager savings to purchase a tract of land to the west, a place described in a letter as fertile and untouched. They had the funds for the land, but needed someone who knew how to turn trees into shelter before the cold weather came. My recent, hard-won skills with the axe, combined with my deeper knowledge of wood, made me a necessary part of their venture. The decision to join them was a terrifying one. It meant spending the last of my silver, every coin I had protected so fiercely, on a share of a place I had never seen. I wrestled with the choice for 2 nights, the feeling of the few coins in my pocket a cold, heavy weight. In the end, the memory of the burgomaster's condescending smile was stronger than my fear. I chose the uncertainty of the forest over the certainty of being someone else's man for the rest of my life. Our journey inland began not with a grand departure, but with the simple, squeaking protest of a single wagon's wheels. The blacksmith owned the wagon, pulled by a tired-looking ox, and it carried the women, the small children, and the most precious supplies. We men walked, my tool chest a familiar, heavy burden across my shoulders. The well-worn roads of the city quickly gave way to a rough track that was little more than 2 ruts carved into the earth. Each step was a conscious effort, my boots sinking into soft soil or stumbling over hidden roots. For days, the world was a wall of green on either side, a dense forest of trees I did not know. The constant, low hum of insects became the background to every sound, a relentless thrum that I felt in my teeth. As we walked, the group began to feel less like a collection of strangers and more like a single, determined creature. The farmer, a quiet man with deep lines around his eyes, would point to plants, telling us which berries were safe and which leaves would make a soothing tea for our tired feet. At night, the baker's skill turned our simple flour and water into warm, nourishing flatbread cooked on a hot stone by the fire. We huddled close to that small blaze, a tiny bubble of warmth and light in a vast and dark wilderness. The communal scent of the campfire, a mix of burning oak and the baker's simple cooking, became a source of comfort. It was a strange thought that a man's life could be reduced to such simple needs: a fire for warmth, bread for strength, and the quiet company of others walking the same uncertain path. One afternoon, a sound from high above made us all stop. It was a sharp, piercing cry, unlike any bird I had ever heard in the forests of home. I looked up, shielding my eyes, but could see nothing through the thick ceiling of leaves. The farmer simply nodded. "That is the sound of a hawk," he said, his voice calm. "It means we are truly in the wild now." That cry seemed to mark a turning point. The land felt different after that, older and less forgiving. That night, my sleep was shallow, filled with the rustling of unseen animals in the underbrush and the distant, lonely call of a wolf. I lay on my blanket, feeling the damp chill of the earth seep into my bones, and wondered if we had the strength to tame such a place, or if it would simply swallow us whole. The physical toll of the journey was immense. My shoulders ached constantly from the weight of my tools, a burning pain that never fully subsided. My feet were a mass of blisters, and I had to wrap them in strips of cloth each morning. But a strange thing happened as the days wore on. My body, though weary, grew harder. The muscles in my back and legs tightened, adapting to the strain. I learned to read the ground ahead, to place my feet where the earth was firm, to use my walking stick for balance on steep slopes. I was no longer just a carpenter walking. I was becoming a traveler, my senses sharpening to the demands of this new world. It was a humbling process, this re-education of my own body, learning to move through a landscape that was completely indifferent to my survival. Then, one evening, as the light began to fade, the farmer, who had been scouting ahead, came back to the group. He did not say a word, but the look on his face was all the announcement we needed. We followed him through a final thicket of brush and then stopped. Before us lay a small, gently sloping valley with a creek snaking through it like a silver ribbon. On either side, the forest stood like a silent army of giants. This was it. This was the plot of land described on the worn piece of paper the blacksmith carried in his coat. We had arrived. A profound quiet fell over our small group as we stood there, taking in the sight. The sheer scale of the work ahead was dizzying. Every home, every field, every fence was locked away inside that dense wall of trees. For a long time, no one moved. The weight of our gamble settled upon us. All of our money, all of our hope was tied to this patch of earth and timber. The risk of failure felt immense, a physical pressure in my chest that made each breath a little tighter. If we could not raise shelter and clear a field before the first snows, we would face a winter of starvation. There was no turning back. The journey itself had taken nearly everything we had. This valley was now our entire world, our only chance. The silence was finally broken by one of the children, a little girl who pointed at a flash of blue as a bird darted from one branch to another. Her small, happy shout seemed to break the spell of our anxiety. Her simple joy reminded me that this place was not just an obstacle, it was a promise. I slipped the heavy tool chest from my aching shoulders, the relief immediate and profound. From it, I took my American axe. The handle, shaped from hickory wood, felt different from my German tools. Less refined, perhaps, but solid, balanced, and powerful. It was a tool made for this very purpose, for this very moment. Its weight felt familiar in my grip now, an extension of my own arm. I walked to the edge of the clearing, to a tall, straight poplar tree
whose smooth, pale bark seemed to glow in the fading light. The other men watched me, their faces illuminated by the last rays of the sun. I planted my feet, took a deep breath, and swung. The sharp steel bit deep into the wood with a ringing sound, a clean, resonant thwack that echoed through the quiet valley. That single sound was not one of destruction, but of creation. It was the first note in the song of our new lives, the first word in a conversation with this wild land. In that moment, the forest ceased to be a terrifying, unconquerable mass. It became a resource, a challenge, a collection of timber waiting for a purpose. The overwhelming fear I had felt moments before was replaced by a clear, focused sense of the task ahead. My understanding of what it meant to begin something new had been reshaped by the simple impact of steel on wood. The ringing sound of that first axe blow hung in the quiet between the trees, a sharp announcement that we were here to stay. It was one thing to strike a single tree, a declaration of intent. It was another thing entirely to look at the solid wall of forest surrounding us and understand that every beam, every wall, and every floorboard for an entire settlement had to be carved from it by hand. The other men stood with their axes held awkwardly, their expressions a mix of determination and pure dread. They were good men, a baker whose hands knew the softness of dough, a weaver familiar with the snap of a loom. But they looked at the towering poplars and oaks as if they were giants from a child's scary tale. I felt a weight settle on my shoulders that had nothing to do with my own fatigue. It was the heavy responsibility of knowing what to do next. This shared understanding led to our first real test as a group. As the sun climbed higher, causing me to wipe a steady trickle of sweat from my brow, the talk turned to building shelters. Each family wanted its own small cabin, a private space to wall off the vast, intimidating wilderness before the cold weather arrived. I listened as they planned, a knot tightening in my stomach. I looked from their earnest faces to our small, precious pile of supplies: sacks of flour, barrels of salted pork, and bags of seed for next spring. They sat on the damp earth, covered only by oilcloth, vulnerable to rain and curious animals. Part of me wanted to agree, to give them the comfort they craved. But my practical carpenter's mind saw a fatal flaw in their logic. I cleared my dry throat, and the talking stopped. "Friends," I began, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the stillness, "a warm home is a wonderful thing, but a warm home with an empty stomach is just a pretty tomb for the winter." I pointed towards our provisions. "That is our life. If we lose that to rot or a hungry bear, our walls will do us no good. Before any family builds a home for themselves, we must first build a home for our food." The idea was met with silence. I saw doubt in their eyes, the fear of sleeping under the open sky for weeks longer. I had to make them see it my way. "We will build a shared storehouse, small, strong, and fast. We will work together on this one thing, and it will protect us all. Then, with our future secure, we will help each other raise the walls of our own homes." I found myself torn between the desire to be liked and the need to be right. After a long moment, the baker nodded slowly. The carpenter speaks sense. A wave of relief washed over me so powerful it almost buckled my knees.
I had chosen to lead, and for now, they had chosen to follow. The next days fell into a rhythm of labor I had never known. Teaching was harder than doing. I showed the baker's son how to hold his axe, not like a club, but as an extension of his own arms, letting its weight do the work. The first few times he swung, he spun nearly all the way around, and we had to share a nervous laugh to break the tension. I demonstrated how to cut a deep wedge on one side of a tree, then a lower cut on the other, to control where it would fall. The first time one of them succeeded, the thunderous crash of the massive poplar hitting the forest floor was followed by a whoop of pure joy from the man who had felled it. We were turning giants into lumber, and with each one that fell, our own confidence grew a little taller. My expertise with wood became a different kind of tool. Back home, I knew the character of every local timber by its smell and grain. Here, I was learning a new language. I discovered the American poplar was lighter and softer than our German pine, perfect for the main walls, as it was easy to hew flat with a broadaxe. For the foundation logs that would sit directly on the damp ground, we needed something tougher, more resistant to rot. We found it in the dense, heavy oak that made our muscles burn and our axe blades dull, but promised to outlast us all. I would run my hand over a felled log, feeling for twists or knots, reading its strength and weakness. It was my job to decide which tree was destined to be a cornerstone and which would become simple roof planks. This process involved solving countless small problems. One large oak we felled had a slight curve to it, making it useless for a straight wall. The men saw it as a waste, but I saw a solution. With careful measuring and a few extra cuts, I showed them how to turn its natural bend into a sturdy roof beam, stronger because of its shape. This small success earned me more trust than any speech could have. We worked side by side, the air filled with the sounds of shared labor. The steady thwack thwack of axes biting into wood became our clock, and the rasp of a two-man saw pulling through a log was our song. My throat was often coated with fine sawdust, and the taste of sweat was a constant companion, washed down with clean, cold water from the nearby creek. While the men felled and shaped the logs, I taught the women and children a different but equally important task. I had them mix clay from the creek bank with dried grasses and water, creating a thick, sticky mud for chinking, the material used to fill the gaps between the logs. Based on a memory of something my grandfather had once said about bog houses, I sent the older children to a marshy spot we had passed to gather armfuls of sphagnum moss. When they returned, their boots caked in black mud, we mixed the damp, springy moss into the clay. This addition would not only help bind the mixture, but would provide extra insulation against the coming winter winds. The earthy smell of the wet clay and crushed moss was the scent of our new homes taking shape. As the walls of the storehouse rose, I introduced them to the saddle notch. It was a simple technique, a shallow curve cut into the bottom of one log so it would sit securely on the rounded top of the log below it. It wasn't the fine, tight-fitting dovetail joinery I would have used for a burgomaster's cabinet, a fact that historians might someday debate as they wonder how our old methods changed in this new place. But it was fast, strong, and something I could teach easily. I carved the first few notches myself, then guided the other men's hands, showing them how to check the fit. There was a deep satisfaction in the solid thud of a well-seated log settling into place, a sound that promised security. It was the sound of a community being built, one piece at a time. This shared effort changed us. Men who had been strangers on the ship, wary and withdrawn, now shouted encouragement to one another across the clearing. We shared our water, our food, and the blisters on our hands. When the weaver, a man much smaller than the rest of us, struggled to lift his end of a heavy log, the baker's son moved to help without being asked. They grunted and strained together, and when the log was finally in place, they clapped each other on the back, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat, but their eyes bright with pride. We were no longer just a collection of families who happened to be from Germany. We were becoming neighbors, bound by the wood we had cut and the walls we were raising together. Finally, the day came when the last roof plank was pegged into place. The storehouse stood before us, a small, stout building that looked as if it had grown right out of the soil. It was not beautiful, and my master in the old country would have scoffed at its rough-hewn logs and visible mud chinking. But to us, it was a fortress. We carefully moved our sacks of flour and barrels of meat inside, stacking them on a raised platform I had built to keep them off the damp ground. The air inside smelled of fresh-cut poplar and damp earth, the scent of survival. Standing together in the doorway, we looked at our collective wealth, protected from the elements and the wild. That evening, as the last light faded from the sky, a profound quiet settled over our clearing. The rhythmic sounds of construction were gone, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the gentle whisper of the wind through the pines. I looked at the dark, solid shape of the storehouse, a black square against the deep blue of twilight. It was more than just a building. It was a promise we had made to each other and kept. It was the first anchor we had put down in this vast, untamed land. The challenge of building not just a structure, but a community had reshaped me in ways I was only starting to comprehend. Now, with our future provisions secured, the real work could begin. Tomorrow, we would start on the first family cabin. I ran a hand over the calluses forming on my palms, a rough map of the work we had done. The men who had once held their axes like foreign objects now knew how to fell a tree with confidence. The women and children who had looked at the forest with fear now knew how to draw building materials from its soil and moss. We had learned the first words in the language of this land, a language spoken not with the tongue, but with the hands and the will. The forest no longer seemed like an enemy to be conquered, but a partner in the new life we were determined to build. With the communal storehouse standing solid and secure, a testament to our shared labor, the time came for each family to turn to their own plot of land. We had worked together as one body to protect our future, but survival now demanded we work as individuals. I stood at the edge of the parcel that was mine, a dense wall of green and brown that seemed to press in on all sides. The trees, ancient and impossibly tall, knitted their branches together, blocking out much of the morning light. A deep quiet resided here, a stillness that was nothing like the familiar silence of the German forests I knew. This quiet felt older, heavier,
and completely indifferent to the small man with an axe who now stood before it. My hands, calloused from building the storehouse, felt strangely soft and inadequate for the task ahead. This was not the careful work of a carpenter. This was the raw, brutal work of making a world from scratch. I took up the American axe we had purchased in Philadelphia. It was a different tool from the ones I was used to, heavier in the head and hung on a long, straight handle of hickory wood. My German axe was a tool for shaping. This was a tool for destroying. Taking a deep breath, I swung it at the trunk of a poplar tree, one of the smaller ones near the edge. The steel bit into the pale wood with a satisfying thunk, sending white chips flying. The echo of the blow seemed to be swallowed instantly by the surrounding woods. I swung again, and then again, finding a rhythm. It was clumsy at first, my shoulders protesting the unfamiliar strain. Sweat soon slicked my back, and a stinging trickle ran into my eyes, forcing me to pause and wipe my brow with the back of a gritty hand. This work had no finesse, no need for the precise measurements and delicate touch my craft demanded. It was a contest of endurance between my own aching muscles and the stubborn life of the tree. As days turned into a week, I began to learn the character of this new forest, much like I would learn the grain of a new piece of lumber. The poplar was soft and fell easily, its wood good for little more than firewood. The oak, however, was a formidable opponent. Its fibrous, tough wood resisted the axe, jarring my arms with every blow, but I knew its strength would be essential for the main beams of my cabin. I learned to read the lean of a tree, to predict its fall, and to use wedges to guide it safely to the ground. My senses, trained for years to notice the slightest imperfection in a piece of wood, began to adapt. The rich, damp scent of the soil I turned over with a grubbing hoe was a perfume of pure potential. My fingers, which could detect a raised grain on a planed board, now learned the rough, abrasive texture of hickory bark and the surprising smoothness of a river stone from the nearby creek. The sheer physical effort was immense, a kind of exhaustion I had never known. Each morning I woke to a chorus of aches, my body a map of the previous day's labor. By midday, my movements would feel sluggish, each swing of the axe requiring a conscious act of will. Water from the creek became the most precious thing in the world, its clean, cold taste a momentary reprieve. Yet, through the exhaustion, a new kind of strength was being forged. I was not merely clearing a patch of ground, I was carving out a space for my life. One morning, just as the first light filtered through the canopy, I paused to catch my breath and saw a movement at the edge of the clearing. A white-tailed deer, a creature of such grace it seemed unreal, stood watching me, its large brown eyes unblinking. We stared at each other for a long moment, two inhabitants of the same world, one old, one new. Then, with a flick of its tail, it vanished back into the trees, as silently as it had appeared. That peaceful image was replaced several days later by a very different encounter. I was wrestling with a thick root, my back to the forest, when a sudden stillness made me freeze. It was a change in the air, a sense of being observed.
I slowly turned, my hand still on the wooden handle of my axe. Standing just inside the tree line were two men. They were not from our settlement. Their skin was the color of rich earth, their hair long and black. They carried bows and moved with a quiet confidence that made my own loud efforts seem clumsy and foolish. They were Lenape, the people who had lived in these forests for generations. We simply looked at each other across the 20 paces that separated us. There was no menace in their gaze, only a deep, unreadable curiosity. They took in the sight of my clearing, the fallen trees, the churned-up earth, the small pile of logs, and then their eyes met mine. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, one of them gave a slight nod, a gesture I could not interpret, and they melted back into the shadows of the woods. The image of those two hunters lingered in my mind long after they were gone. They had moved through the forest as if they were part of it, like the deer or the hawk. I, on the other hand, was fighting it, chopping and digging and tearing it apart to make my home. It made me wonder what it truly meant to belong to a place. Was it a piece of paper, a deed bought in a crowded city office that gave a man ownership? Or was it a deeper knowledge, an understanding of the land's quiet language that came only from listening for a lifetime? You see, a man can own a forest, but that does not mean he knows it. The Lenape hunters knew it. They wore its silence like a comfortable coat, while I was still trying to shout it down with the noise of my axe. Their presence was a quiet reminder that I was not the first person to call this land home, and that my struggle for survival was taking place on a stage that had seen countless seasons before I ever arrived.
Because of this, I began to watch and listen more carefully, to see the clearing not just as a work site, but as a living place. I started to notice the smaller things, the way a certain bird called only before rain, the scuttling sounds in the undergrowth at dusk, the paths the animals used to the creek. I was learning the rhythms of my small plot of land. I could tell by the feel of the ground under my boots where the soil was rich and dark, and where it was thin and stony. These were not the skills of a carpenter, but they felt just as essential. My hands were still my primary tools, but now my eyes and ears were working just as hard, gathering a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge that was necessary not just for building, but for living. This new awareness, this constant, quiet observation, was what led me to my most valuable discovery. I noticed that gray squirrels, chattering and bold, were frequently returning to one particular type of tree, with smooth gray bark. I had marked these trees for felling, as their wood was not ideal for building. But the squirrels seemed obsessed with them, gnawing at the bark and licking something from the wounds they made. My curiosity got the better of me. One afternoon, I walked over to one of the trees and examined the bark. Where a branch had broken off in a past storm, a clear, watery liquid was slowly oozing out, glistening on the trunk. I thought of my grandfather, who used to say that in the deep of winter, you could drink the water from inside a birch tree if you were lost. This was not a birch, but the principle might be the same. Hesitantly, I dipped a finger into the sticky liquid and brought it to my lips.
It was a surprise, mostly watery, but with a distinct, faint sweetness. An idea sparked in my mind, a hopeful and exciting thought. Using my knife, I carefully whittled a small spout from a piece of elder branch, hollowing out the center. I made a shallow V-shaped cut into the bark of the maple tree, for I now recognized it as a maple, and gently tapped my spout into place. Almost immediately, a single clear drop formed at the end. It hung there for a moment, then fell. Drip. Another followed. Drip. It was the slowest, most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I fashioned a crude bucket from a wide piece of bark, folded and pinned with twigs, and placed it on the ground to catch the sap. It seemed a foolishly small effort, collecting this liquid drop by drop, but it was a chance, a way to create something useful directly from the forest without having to destroy it. That evening, as the distant howl of a wolf echoed through the valley, a lonely sound that always sent a shiver down my spine, I sat by my small campfire. I had collected nearly half a bucket of the clear sap. I hung my iron cookpot over the flames and poured the liquid in. For hours I tended the fire, watching as the sap bubbled and steamed. The water slowly boiled away, and the liquid in the pot grew thicker and darker. A wonderfully sweet aroma, like nothing I had ever smelled before, began to drift from the pot, a warm and comforting scent that pushed back against the vast, dark wilderness around me. The process took patience, the kind of patience a craftsman knows well, waiting for the wood to cure or the glue to set. It was a slow transformation, turning the thin blood of the tree into something rich and precious. Finally, all that remained was a thick, dark syrup at the bottom of the pot. I let it cool, and it hardened into a small, brittle cake of sugar. I broke off a piece and placed it in my mouth. The flavor was incredible, deeply sweet, with a smoky taste from the fire and a hint of the forest itself. It was more than just a sweet treat. It was a victory. This small lump of sugar was proof that I could not only survive here, but perhaps even thrive. It was a resource I had found not through brute force, but through quiet observation and ingenuity. It was the first gift the land had given me, a reward for finally learning to pay attention. That small taste of sweetness was a powerful counterpoint to the endless labor and the lonely quiet of the nights. Holding that piece of hardened sugar, I felt a connection to this place that went deeper than the cuts my axe had made. It was a secret shared between me and the trees. The memory of the Lenape hunters, their silent passage through this same forest, lingered in my thoughts. Perhaps this was the beginning of learning their language, not with words, but with an understanding of the gifts the land would offer to those who took the time to look. My hands were blistered, and my back ached, but for the first time since leaving Germany, I felt a flicker of something that was not just survival, but genuine hope. The taste of that first sugar, wrested from the wild woods, stayed with me for a long, long time. And so, our journey alongside those German settlers comes to a quiet close for the evening. Picture the end of one of their first long days in a new world. The sound of the axe has fallen silent, the day's hard labor complete. In the clearing, a new cabin stands, and through its simple window comes the first gentle glow from the hearth, a small, steady light against the vast darkness. That warmth was their reward, a quiet promise of belonging after a long and arduous passage from their old village life.
Let that same sense of earned tranquility settle over you now. Just as they laid down their tools, you can lay down the day's thoughts and concerns. May your rest be as deep and restorative as theirs was, anchored in the peace of a day well spent. Sleep soundly.